Valuation's a big deal. So let's talk a little bit more about it. The valuation is dependent on who the parties are to the transaction. Okay? There is not one value. I could pick, say, Pierce Phelps, Bob Cervani's here, the CFO of the company. You pick on them for a moment, their company. He could ask me to do a valuation of his company today and do it under 5 different scenarios. One would be an ESOP, one would be a sale to employees, one would be a strategic outside third party, one would be a private equity firm. Pick the 5th one, doesn't matter. Every one of them would come up with a different number. There isn't one value for the company. Why? A third party that's got a strategic interest in that business would look at it differently because they've got synergies that are going to come with it, so they'd be willing to pay more, right? An investment firm, like a private equity firm, has limits to what they can pay because they have to have money to return to the people that invest with them. They have to get a rate of return to send back to shareholders. They have a different point of view. By the way, they have a different cost of capital. Let's pick the first example. A large public company with cash sitting on its balance sheet that doesn't need to go borrow to buy a private company, their cost of capital is very low. Go down to the other end of the spectrum and suppose the other option is to sell it to a group of employees. That value is going to be drastically different because capital is scarce, they don't have access to it, it's more expensive. So if you look along this spectrum, why values are higher and lower has to do with your ability to sustain a mistake if you're the buyer. In very simple terms. I'm not going to see that in a valuation textbook, but that's the way I look at it. The employees cannot overpay, because if they overpay, the whole thing collapses because they don't have access to money. A large public company, HP, they made a $7 billion mistake. Oops. Ooh, okay. I lost my job, $7 billion, whatever that number was with that thing that they bought last week. It was a gigantic mistake. But it's not going to sink Hewlett-Packard because they've got a lot of resources. So valuation here, the rule is there is no rule. It depends on who the parties are, what their costs of capital are, and how much access to capital they have. So I will give you, something happens to me a lot. I'll have people who approach us and say, I'm thinking about doing this transaction with my kids. I need a valuation. So I'm going to give you some advice to save you some money. Anybody ever have a valuation report written? We do them. How thick are they? Yeah, about an inch, inch and a half. I don't know, it depends on who writes them. We do them for estate and gift stuff. If you're in a situation where you want to get started on thinking about this, you do not need a 40-page valuation report that you're going to go to one number in the middle and say, okay, that's the number, and pay for all the rest of the stuff. That's a product that's used to submit in court. It's used with IRS, with gifts, right? There's times when you do need to pay for that inch-thick book, but in this case, you need advice. You need advice that considers the company's financial resources, talk about ranges, right? It's an imprecise science. When you value IBM today at the close of business, it's not imprecise. It is whatever the market decided it is. You look in the paper, it's $156 a share. It's the end of the story. Private company valuation is more of a range concept. Even when you know who the two parties are, it's a range. You ultimately got to shake hands on a number, but it's not done the same way if it's a public company or depending on who the parties are. It's very different. So valuation, and we probably next year, we're going to do another series of these. We're probably going to do a program just on valuing private companies. So you can see how it works. So it really does matter. But the point is that there is not one value, and don't start the process by saying, well, I got to get started. I need to buy a $15,000 valuation report. In some cases, a lot more than that, but because you're going to use one number in there, and the rest of it, do you care about the national economy when you're trying to figure out how to get started with your family transaction? Probably not. You just want some advice. So start with some advice on that.